Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description that will show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. You can also watch us online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you so that we can help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. We are starting a new quarter, but we are staying also in the same book. So this is session 1, but we are continuing on in the Gospel of John. In fact, we're going to be looking at John chapter 12, starting in verse 1 and going through verse 11. And this is titled, Why Wasn't This Sold? So again, this is session 1, titled, Why Wasn't This Sold? And we're going to be looking at John chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Now, as we begin our study today, I want you to think about maybe a time that you attended a fancy or a formal dinner party. Kind of thinking the context, maybe you've never done that, and that's okay. Maybe just think of the fanciest dinner party that you've ever attended. Excuse me. And what was that like, and what was going on? And this is really the question I kind of want to put at the end of that is, what were they celebrating? Why was there a formal dinner party going on? Or why were you attending a fancy dinner? Was there a reason behind it? And for some of us, that reason might have been it was just a special event, like a tradition. Maybe you were a part of an organization and they have an annual banquet. Like kind of a winter, maybe it's a Christmas dinner or maybe just an annual banquet where you induct new members into an organization. I kind of think about even here in the Hardin County area, there's been times in the past where I've attended the Clarity, what used to be the Clarity Banquet, which was a formal dinner that was part of a fundraising thing, and it was kind of an annual thing like that. Or was it a formal dinner that was connected to maybe the honor of somebody? Maybe it was a dinner for a special award that was given out and they were honoring the recipient of that award. Or maybe it was a retirement dinner where someone that you know was retiring and they were hosting a special dinner to honor him or her and to maybe give them a gift or just to celebrate their career. You know, kind of think about that. What was it that was the reason for that dinner? And I want to follow that up. If you've kind of got that vision in your mind, I want to follow that up with this question, which is, what are some other ways that we demonstrate honor to people in our culture? So if you think about that formal dinner, and hopefully it was a formal dinner that was really honoring somebody, or maybe even just honoring a cause or something like that, what are ways what are some other ways that we do that? Like how is it done in the dinner? Maybe talk about that. Or what are some other ways that we honor somebody? And I want you to take a couple minutes and I want you to kind of think through that. How do we honor people? And here's what we want you to do as we go through our study. We want you to take some time and pause our video in order to really think about some of the questions that we are asking. So if we encourage you to pause the video and you're watching this by yourself, we want you to get a notebook and a pen and maybe actually take some time to write some things out, journal some things out. If you're watching this with your spouse or another family member, maybe you could take the time to have that discussion, really talk through it, and then in both cases, whenever you're ready, just hit play again. So we want you to pause the video and answer this question: what are some other ways to demonstrate honor to people in our culture? Pause the video, take a couple minutes to think through that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so we've already talked about, having a special dinner or a formal banquet in order to honor somebody. We also often give gifts. The first thing that comes to my mind is giving them a plaque or a picture or a watch to kind of celebrate the fact that they have done such a good job. I used to attend or actually, I used to work at a bank, and every year they would have a breakfast, and it was early in the morning before the bank really opened up, and we would attend this really nice breakfast. And at that breakfast, they would give out awards, and you would get a pen, and maybe a plaque and a couple other things to celebrate what you had done and to celebrate the work that you did. The book says this. It says, with today's session, we are starting a new quarter, but we are continuing our study in John's Gospel. Last quarter ended with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11, and today's study examines something that happened not long after that. Jesus was the honored guest at a dinner in Bethany the week before his death. But what John emphasized was a startling act of worship and generosity along with Jesus' response. And so what we're actually going to see happen is the transition from John chapter 11 to John chapter 12 is really that transition from Jesus kind of performing this last, and what I would call this capstone miracle of raising a dead person back to life. And we are beginning that straight track to the crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection. And even though we're only halfway through the book, the entire rest of the Gospel of John really only makes up of about 2 weeks worth of thing. It's really going right into what we're seeing is going right into the Passover. We are literally in this same chapter. We have Palm Sunday. We have the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. We have the week prior to the crucifixion, and then the immediate days following the crucifixion where we have the resurrection. And so really we're looking at a less than 2 week period is what half of John's gospel is going to be. And so all of it's significant. I don't think John is doing this on accident. I think John is very aware that he is doing a zoom in on some of the things that happened in this 1 week between the triumphant entry and into the resurrection, or into the crucifixion and resurrection. And so that's kind of how John structured his letter. And so we're going to really begin to see how Jesus himself is moving that way, that mentally Jesus is looking towards, looking forward to, not that he's excited about it, but he is looking forward to Calvary and looking forward to the crucifixion. So let's see that. We're going to see that along with a few other things here in John chapter 12. And so I want to start with John chapter 12 and read just the first 3 verses here. And as we do so, I want you to look for how Jesus is being honored in this passage. So in John chapter 12, we're going to start in verse 1 and read through to verse 3. It says this: 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, the one Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there, and Martha was serving them, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with them. Then Mary took a pound of perfume, pure and expensive nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped his feet with her hair, so that the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So as we kind of look at this passage, we see some specific things. One, we see that he's come back to Bethany, and as he's there, that they give a dinner for him. So he is the guest of honor. Not only is he the guest of honor, but Lazarus is reclining at the table with him, and Mary and Martha are part of the serving and part of the ones kind of taking care of the party. There's really an idea here that everything is revolving around Jesus, and probably this is a response to what Jesus had done with Lazarus. The fact that Jesus has raised Lazarus from the grave. He had left for a little bit. We kind of see that in the previous chapter. And then he has come back to Bethany just outside of Jerusalem. And this is how they responded. It's almost like all of this happened, and it was such a shock and such an amazing thing. He left, and then when they found out he was coming back, they actually had a time to properly thank him. And so they're doing that with this meal, and Lazarus and Mary and Martha are all going to be involved in this. We can actually look at how this passage plays out in other Gospels to see that he's actually at the house of someone called Simon the leper. And so not only is this a celebration of of Lazarus' resurrection, but also this is probably a way for Simon the leper to say thank you, because the fact that he's known as Simon the leper, but he's hosting a dinner party, probably implies that Jesus had healed him as well, and he had been declared clean, and he was able to do this. And so he is honoring Jesus in this way. So the dinner party itself is a celebration of Jesus, but also the act of Mary, that there is this anointing, and that she is taking time to give him perfume and to take care of him. This is a action of love and of sacrifice. In a day and age where people did not bathe regularly and all that stuff, to anoint someone with perfume or oil or anything like that was a very big deal, and a very, very loving thing, and really, in the case of this one, we see as a very extravagant thing, as Mary is bringing out something that is her very, very, very best, and is really just giving it to Jesus, just blessing Jesus with this thing. We see several other anointings in the gospel. In fact, Luke chapter 7 seems to be one that is extremely similar to this one. And a lot of times, if we look at Luke 7 and what we find in Matthew and Mark and John, we may be inclined to believe that they're all talking about the same story. But there are enough differences, specifically between Luke's and John's, that these are probably two separate events. One taking place earlier in Jesus' ministry and taking place up in Galilee. One that is just really an act of love and just an act of appreciation for forgiveness of sins, while this one, we're going to see that John is really looking at this more with the crucifixion in mind, and more with that kind of Good Friday event in mind. So more than likely, there's been more than one person throughout Jesus' ministry who, in response to what Jesus has done for them, has anointed him. And so we're probably seeing more than one event, even though they may seem similar for different reasons. The book had this to say. It said Jewish leaders believed that Jesus had violated the Sabbath on multiple occasions and wanted to arrest and execute him as a result. There was a danger about holding this dinner in light of the fact that the Sanhedrin wanted to know where Jesus was and really had a plan to kind of arrest him and get rid of him. However, because of what they were doing, and maybe a little bit because of the fact that the Sanhedrin and those who were trying to kill Jesus had a fear of doing this out in the open, they host the dinner party nonetheless. People like Lazarus and Mary and Martha and even Simon the leper, they may have been oblivious to this, but I don't think Jesus was. He was aware of what was going on, and I would even maybe argue that if Jesus was avoiding death, he probably would have gone to Galilee and been far removed from all these things, but he knew that the time and the hour was approaching, and so he did not live in fear of this. This brings us to Mary's offering. Mary gives a very luxurious and extravagant thing. I want to listen to this again. It says, "Then Mary took a pound of perfume, and it was pure and expensive nard." Now, I'm not overly familiar with what nard is, but this would have been a very expensive perfume. That I read in our study stuff that this would be one that has come out of India. This has not been diluted with olive oil or anything else. It was a very strong smell to it, a good smell, especially culturally at this time, a very good smell. And what it was a very expensive thing. This was something that she had maybe saved up for. This was something that she had collected over time, and was a very wonderful and luxurious thing. Not only was it expensive, but it was also very aromatic. It was a powerful thing, so that when she began to lavish this onto Jesus, putting it on his head, and we see in this passage on his feet, that it would have not only just been an amazing gift for Jesus, but it would have filled the whole room with the smell of this expensive and beautiful nard. And this leads the book to ask this question, which was, what can we say about Mary based on John's description here? And the book goes on to say this about it. It says she was simply determined to honor Jesus with her gift and by her actions. And so when we look at this, we can tell that her number one thing, the thing that she was most concerned about, the thing that she cared the most about, was to make sure that Jesus got the honor and the credit and the love that she felt due him, that she wanted to express because, and probably in light of her gratitude for bringing her brother back from the dead, and maybe just in light of the fact of who he was. Mary seems to be one of those that really kind of got the significance of Jesus. Now, I'm not convinced that she understood everything everything about Jesus being the Christ and all those things, but definitely understood that this Jesus is not only important, but he is the most important thing to ever come into her life. And she wanted to honor him in that way. The book points this out, and we're going to kind of see this from Jesus' response, is that if you think about it, Mary's the only one who successfully prepared Jesus' body for burial, because she was the one who anointed him with this nard and did this a week before his death, literally days before his death. But by the time the women got a chance to go and to do the thing after his death, to anoint him and prepare and give him and prepare his body with spices, he'd already resurrected. And so what she has done is she's the only one who actually really prepared his body for his burial. And that's kind of an interesting reality about her. This does leave us with one more question, which is this: how should we respond to Jesus' work in our lives? As we already mentioned, Mary, this is a response of appreciation, love, and gratitude toward Jesus for what he had done in her life, specifically raising her brother from the dead. But what about us? How should we respond to Jesus' work in our lives? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, and think about that, discuss that, write some things down, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, hopefully you've come up with some great things. And I think in the midst of all of this, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment, is the idea of giving God our best. Not our scraps, not what's left over. Don't give God your time after everything else has been satisfied. Don't give God the scraps. Give God your best. And that's what we see Mary doing above anything else, is in light of who Christ is and what he's done in our life, we should respond by giving God our best. The book goes on to say this. It says, haters gonna hate is a popular saying in our culture. It means someone is always going to complain or find fault with something. As it turns out, what's true in the 21st century was also true in the first century. Someone at the banquet had a problem with Mary's extravagant gift and her act of worship. Let's look at that by looking at verses 4 through 8. And I want you to listen for the attitudes and motivation behind Judas' question. So picking up in verse 4, we read this. Then one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was about to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this perfume sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and he was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put into it. Jesus answered, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." So as we kind of look at Judas' attitude, we kind of get, first off, he is presenting an idea of righteous indignation. He's presenting the idea that, like, hey, we could have better used that. We could have had a bigger impact on the community if we had taken that. The 300 denarii would have literally represented like an entire year's worth of wages. This was, if you want to think about this for this woman, this represented a year's worth of wages. So this would have been like your salary for a year. If we could average that out, somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 today, that may not be a great analogy today. That might be a little bit much, even by our standards, but it was a huge sum of money that this woman had just lavished on Jesus. And he's saying, hey, we could have used that in different ways. We could have used that for better ways. We see from this passage that Judas had become the kind of money keeper for the disciples. He was the one in charge of giving money to the poor, of taking in collections. If people wanted to give Jesus and the disciples money on their way, Judas was in charge of that. He was the one who took it. And we also see from this passage that Judas used that as an opportunity to take some extra for himself. He was holding some of that back. He was either using the money for his own personal things along the way, or he was even keeping some separate for his own personal gain or whatever it might have been. He was being dishonest in these things, but he was putting on the appearance of being more righteous or more aware of the needs of other people than even Mary was. And because of that, he used that to criticize Mary. The book says this. It says also that there were other disciples who probably agreed with him about the perfume and costing a year's wages that could have been done for the benefit of the poor. We can look at Matthew 26 or Mark 14 to realize that even though Judas is very much certain the spokesperson and the initiator of it, and he had ill intent behind it, that really the other disciples were probably quick to get on board with him. They're probably like, yeah, we could have used that better. We could have had, that was a waste, was kind of what they were saying, is that was a waste when we could have benefited more people because of it. However, that's not how we see Jesus respond to it. And I want to ask this question. It says, how do we reconcile Judas being involved in ministry as a disciple with his betrayal that led to Jesus being arrested? And the reason we ask that question is you have Judas here he is a disciple, and he is acting like he is really super spiritual, even to the point of criticizing Mary and what she has done. But we have that whole picture, and we got to kind of think about that and kind of address that for ourselves. And how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile that Judas was involved in the ministry, but also he was the one that was going to be a betrayer? How do we see those two things coming together? Why don't you go ahead and pause the video, think about that for a little bit, write some things down, and then we'll keep going in our study. This is a tough one, isn't it? This is really a tough one for us to consider, because we have this, this guy who in a lot of ways really misrepresents what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and yet he was still at the table. He was eating with Jesus. He is going to be at the Last Supper. He washes, we get into this in just a few chapters. Jesus washes his feet, knowing full well he is going to betray Jesus. And one of the things I would say about this, and first and foremost, is don't put your faith in people. Even when we as the church, we hear stories after story, and it's heartbreaking really, of people that cease to be a part of the church, in any way, shape, or form because of a person that they had a disagreement with. Now, sometimes that is because they're in their sin and they're angry for someone for calling out their sin. I get that. But a lot of times it's the reality that we in the church are sinners as well, and sometimes we do wrong by people, and they aren't treated the way they deserve to be treated. And because of that reality, people get hurt, and they don't have anything to do with the church anymore. And we have to remember that even in Jesus' most inner circle were those who were ultimately would betray Jesus, would betray his mission, and would lead him to be crucified. We have to remember that even among ourselves. I was listening to a thing recently, and it said that we need to kind of quit looking at things and saying you sinners and start looking at things and saying us sinners. And we have to recognize for all of us, all of us that are connected to Jesus, that it's us sinners, and that there are going to be people that are going to mess up, they're going to sin, they're going to make mistakes, and we want to extend to them the same grace that Christ extends to us, and we want to show them the same love that even Jesus showed towards Judas. And that's hard to do, but it's important. I want to read to you verse 8 again, and I want us to really think about this, what Jesus says here. I want to read 7 and 8. He says, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." And we have to kind of ask the question, what does he mean by that? What is he saying here? Well, first off, I want to point out he's not saying that we shouldn't help the poor. Because Jesus has a very long ministry of helping the poor. In fact, if we can look at his interaction with the rich young ruler, and he says, in all the midst of that, he says, I've kept all the commandments. He's wrong, but he's saying that. And he goes, what else do I lack? And Jesus says, take your possessions, sell them, give them to the poor, and follow me. So Jesus had some concern for the poor, and it wasn't that he was telling his disciples to not give to the poor, but rather he's kind of pointing out the importance, or what is the main thing. We as Christians a lot of times forget that to keep the main thing, and we do that for a lot of good causes. You think about all of the good causes that the church is connected to, whether it's pro-life things, whether it's giving to the poor, whether it's supporting victims of abuse or other things, helping refugees. There's a lot of things that we as the church are involved in, and they're good things and they're important things. Within this church, we have people who work for different organizations or support different organizations on a lot of different levels, and all of those are good things, but all of those must be submitted to the glorification of God and the worship of God. And so what Jesus is pointing out in this passage is helping the poor is important, and we need to help the poor. We're commanded to help the poor, but we need to remember that helping the poor is a way that we glorify God and worship God, and we should not sacrifice the worship of God and glorifying God for the sake of helping the poor. And so what Jesus points out in this is, listen, I'm not going to be around forever. And she is honoring me. She is worshiping me. She is expressing love towards me. Don't question what she is doing and how it could have been used in a better way. She is worshiping me with a pure heart and with pure intent, and that should be the most important thing. And I would challenge you, think about maybe the things that are your causes, that are very important to me. Maybe it is helping the poor. Maybe it is helping women with unplanned pregnancies and making life-affirming choices. Maybe it's helping victims of abuse or violence or something like that. Who knows what yours might be? Those are great and worthy causes. But don't lose our call to glorify and worship God in the midst of those things. And it can happen. It can happen to me. It can happen to anybody. We could even go so far as to say, don't get lost in the act of doing church to the point that you're no longer worshiping God. We need to remember what the main thing is, and we need to keep the main thing. And the main thing is to glorify God, to worship Him and make much of Him and honor Him in all that we do. We need to not forget that. That's an important thing. This leads us to the last part of our passage. It says, John included her story, and we know what Mary did, and we're called to follow her example. But then let's look at how things kind of end up in this passage. So we're going to pick up in verse 9, and we're going to read through to verse 11. And this is going to take us right up to Palm Sunday and right up to the triumphant entry. And as we look at these last few verses, I want you to look for the reasons that the large crowds gathered. Let's just look for that. It says this, "Then a large crowd of the Jews learned that he was there. And they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, the one who'd been raised from the dead. But the chief priests had decided to kill Lazarus also, because he was the reason many of the Jews were deserting them and believing in Jesus." It's the spectacle, right? And I like how the book says, it says they were probably neither faithful followers nor hostile enemies, but they were just curious onlookers. And so these were people that were starting to want to go see Jesus, wanting to see him, wanting to see Lazarus, because they were just curious about what was going on. At most, maybe, they wanted to be able to tell their kids someday, yeah, I'd seen it. I was there. I had seen it. I met Jesus. There's a reality even to us today that if there's an opportunity to meet someone famous, we may take advantage of that just so we can say, yes, we met someone famous. You may, if your kids ever ask you the question, who's the most famous person you've ever got to meet, that you'll have this answer or that answer, whether it's an athlete or an actor or the president or whatever it might be. They're going to ask who was the most famous person you've ever met, and you'll be able to say it was this person. Or, Dad, did you see, did you ever go see a president speak and have those experiences? You're going to ask that. That's what these people were. They were onlookers. They were there to just see it and maybe catch a glimpse of a miracle so that they could tell their kids one day. But they were not followers of Jesus, but they weren't against him either. They just wanted to experience it. The last verse of the section is really pretty interesting, and it says, so they have these onlookers. It says, but the chief priest decided to kill Lazarus because he was one of the reasons the Jews seemed to be deserting them and going and following Jesus. And man, what an interesting reality that these leaders were not only threatened by Jesus, but now also Lazarus, that they had been ruled by their jealousy and they were threatened by Jesus' popularity. And now, along with that, They were angry at Lazarus because he was a physical representation of who Jesus was. And you just have to notice this when it says that they were deserting them. That really speaks to the fear that they had in them, does it not? Because they looked at what Lazarus was doing, that Lazarus' existence, and they said, people are deserting us. We are losing our influence and our power and our following because of the things that Jesus is doing. And this guy represents that. And we need to get rid of all of them before we have no one left to teach. The book closes with these questions. It says, were the leaders more like Mary or Judas? And how can the way a person honors Jesus bring others to him? And I want to close your time with that. I want you to ask the question, were the Pharisees being more like Mary, or were they being more like Judas? And then with that, how can we, and I'm going to ask it this way, how can we honor Jesus in such a way that brings other people to him? And that's a great question, because it says, how can the way a person honors Christ bring others to them? But I want to personalize that. How can we honor Jesus that brings other people to him? So here's what I want you to do. Close out your time answering this question. How can we honor Jesus to bring other people to him? And then pray. And then we encourage you to join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church at 11 o'clock, both in person. We'd love for you to join us, but also online through Facebook Live. Thank you so much for joining us today. God bless.